Near Howard, yeah.
2 blocks
That's
from
right.
our place.
Yeah.
St.
Oh.
John's.
Oh, okay.
That's just perfect. It starts at 7:25 at the hour.
Oh, okay.
The audio's not coming through that?
Oh, there you go. Oh, you can come over and help me too.
I don't know, God, I'm not cheap.
She would earn it though when she was.
Was the meeting?
I'm not sure what this house is.
One of my girlfriends and I were joking about starting a business to help people, especially elderly people who need to sell their houses.
Oh, yeah.
Encourage, like, that'd be an awesome business to do. Super low
I'm talking.
overhead. And, you know,
Yeah.
you need to tell people,
Yeah, that's it too.
Oh, yeah.
And this is Brandon.
Oh.
They go.
Okay,
Like
so.
they started this next week.
Yeah. I think so much.
And then, well, that.
Take that and put it up against the thing. That is that one, right?
Assistant professor of military science, Blackville, Marquette. Full-time Marquette. And a lot of professors are teaching.
This is where it's attached to here's possibilities. Have an audio long and try it.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
And then we're gonna text that one too, instead of giving them Bill or Pat.
it's just like, it's really cool. Maybe it's right as we're all-
Yeah.
I got the link ready.
Okay.
If you go, you can text it to as well.
Okay.
But it's on the Wisconsin International Radio YouTube.
Very
Yeah,
cool.
fine.
It was so cool.
And
To have it in terms
they
of-
just, dude, they suck. Cause it's like, you just see the more.
Well, hey,
You know, they just kind of like, and how's it going?
Legos, that's what my boys
And,
are playing with right now.
She wisely, like, realized in this thing.
I haven't seen one of these things since the
Not
90s.
picking it up.
And like, then literally was getting.
Outlet protectors?
Dude, come to our house, they're everywhere.
What's that?
Outlet protectors. Those probably have outlets.
As you look past the budget now that it's behind you, if you will, what would you say
Outlet
top
protectors,
three
you
goals
can
are
stop
in the next
Democrats from putting forks in the house.
Not really.
yeah, for the volume, I think
Yeah.
you just turned me, oh, it's already turned up.
Yeah, so we're trying to, we'd like to actually just get the computer to like go through the audio. but
Oh,
we
yeah.
can't seem to do
Let
that.
me get the librarian.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, actually, I'm from Virginia, but, around here. We moved out here in '07. Also, I'm a mechanical engineer. Yeah, many more opportunities down here, so.
Bug Age fan is pronounced Bug, yes. Yeah, we'll get started here. Yeah, so whenever it was interesting. And then the top joke.
I don't want to sit down too early when more of a standing.
The volume from the laptop.
No, I didn't.
Hi there. Maybe we can get the audio from the computer to come out through the speaker.
And then you have, and then, so before.
That's, technology was,
We used to be able to do it
Yeah, that's what we were trying to play with there, but.
Nothing happens on here.
And she told me it's his microphone only.
Forum will be starting shortly.
There's a volume thing on there.
Really? Who's it been over there? And she started like, kind of went on a rant. Did you get over 3 in a row or? When they're like,
Playgrounds.
Judah, they're like, oh yeah, partnership between Phillips, private university.
We have that here.
Oh, she didn't tell me anything about that. She said that plug in.
And then,
It was really, that they talked about. It was actually, it is that.
I got the volume also.
Miles goes, why don't you get into the program?
They were I'm live streaming this right now, and I'm also gonna video the whole thing, put that out. But we should talk right after about shooting more video.
I may have to go to Madison.
Huh. I said today or?
Maybe sooner rather than later. The two of us. Miles and
No, I have the footage that we shot. It's just like going through, just like trying to figure out like how to. I mean, I'll send it all to you, but like just trying to like do more of a 30-second, minute long. The thing is, like, the shorter it is, the more people are gonna see it, you know. But
And then.
yeah. Which, I mean, that stuff's important, but like, how do we get the most amount of people to watch our videos? I mean, if you look through the videos I made for Bill that are, a minute long, and just, talking about, what a lower tax is, or localized government.
Governor Hughes, as you look at pass the vote.
Sorry. It works now.
You did post something on
Live.
Yeah, I got that live stream going, so you and Patrick can share it on your, it's going right now.
Say hello to everybody.
Well, anyway, I'm gonna set this up, we'll talk about it.
Yeah, we have to do it like.
They're pretty good.
They're both very good.
Oh, my mom's at the house.
My friends are very.
Alright. Well, let me go
See
see
what
the
they
stuff.
think.
Yep.
Well, hey, Phil.
We'll open it up.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I'm close to 6.
No, that's fine.
You want to get us after the
No, I was out last Saturday and, taking the gym out to eat. Every time I go down there,
Go down today?
Reserve that spot on the end.
Yep, I brought you.
Man, I burned the hell out of my hand. Like 2 weeks ago, it was stupid. I was burning like paperwork in the fire pit behind my house, and I didn't actually touch the fire pit. I was burning the box, and the plastic out there is sizzling.
Yeah.
Almost matching. Sweater is over.
Phil, you met Pat before. This is Matt's parents. So Pat Hoffman and Rob here. And then Patrick Bear. Yeah, yep.
How are you? Tape recorder for me. WI Radio, YouTube, link, Phil, share it. Repost.
Thank you, bud. No, it's like a short exchange. So they put out a presentation on, hey, this is how. Private.
here's the guy,
I'm trying to get
But let's cap.
well planned, like it's actually.
let's get you ready.
Just cross it over.
So you're gonna have forever?
Yeah. But that. They were a couple of Okay. Thank you very much.
So in other words, we end up. Is that what you meant to say?
Well, no, I mean, that's about
12 seconds, 4 seconds. Syncing audio 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Audio links. A, B, C. Test, test. Testing, testing.
Yeah, I don't.
Testing, testing.
I can hear you.
Well, respect, but also.
I mean, on my Facebook feed.
I'm just sync. I'm just laughing.
Test, test, audio test. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Test, test, test. I'm going to right now. I'm going to.
Well, I should say. Yeah. It's cool. So we were here at these. Yeah, I was and it was actually like cool.
Sorry, I'm going. It's gonna wait for one. There's supposed to be one more speaker.
We're gonna take the. Did you bring your show? Oh
Give it
no.
1 minute, but then we're gonna give one. And then we'll probably go into, yeah, we'll go to Jason. Reese,
That's okay.
for order. That's right. We do break and then we'll do. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, whatever you're comfortable with. So.
Yeah. I suggest if you were to leave
Oh, we did survive. Yeah.
You're not gonna get.
Oh,
You're not gonna get-
when I got those emails.
Don't throw away the refill box.
No, no, he wears that.
No, I wear that one.
Yeah,
And then he's like, "We're not getting it." So I'm like, "Well, it's ready."
Besides, you wanna do that, I'll buy you another.
Determining how their children are educated, whether it's through parochial or a charter, or I did send out a lot of invites, and I did not hear back from quite a few candidates. So disappointingly, we're not going to be able to hear that point of view. But what I would hope is, for those of you I don't know, and maybe aren't libertarian, I hope you listen to us with an open mind, and maybe we can all learn from each other. So if you don't know, those of you who don't know about me, I'm a Milwaukee police detective. I've been with the Milwaukee Police Department for the past 11 years. Father of 3, live in the Jackson Park area of Milwaukee. The reason I got into this race is that we need an independent voice that's representative of our district. Not a party and not an ideology, representative of our district so we can best represent and best vote for legislation that will positively impact the citizens of Milwaukee and Milwaukee County and the state of Wisconsin. More so, as this was developing, we deal with this terrible line of communication between Madison and Milwaukee. There's constant political infighting and partisan lines are drawn. In the end, we want the same goal. We want the best opportunity. We want the best education for our children. Talking about expanding school choice. The Democratic Party will, any questions? So what we're gonna do, anybody? No? All right, good. All right, so.
Which comes in real handy when you're talking about things like education. Talked about efficiencies and effectiveness, and when we're looking at budgets and costs, and education is important, and we need to find the money to pay for those particular programs. But it has to come from somewhere. So briefly, when I'm making a comparison, I'd like to bring up another particular issue that libertarians have been at the forefront of before being at the front of it was cool, and that's the area of cannabis and that legalization. Like many of my colleagues, I think that if you're 21 years of age or older and you're a responsible adult and you can use it responsibility, that you should have the right to do so, just like is happening in states like Colorado and Nevada, and I don't exactly see the sky falling in those particular states. Here, we're in other states that it's not legal, we're incarcerating people. I think that's an inefficient use of our resources. Not to mention that I should say that for myself personally, I think that Wisconsin is a state that should go through the evolution of being a medicinal state. Let's just turn off. I could talk louder. Is that okay? Maybe the battery ran out. I think Wisconsin is a state that should go through the process of being medicinal. I think that would behoove us on a variety of issues, but I think we can leave that topic for another day. What I'm bringing up is the comparison that if we're talking about inefficient use of funds on a budgetary issue, and we need funds over in the area of education, that we can find those funds and we can use them over here where they're needed. But it's not enough for me, with the upbringing that I had and some of the mentors that I had, that we simply take funds from over here and place them over here without looking to see if we're using them most efficiently and effectively. Okay? And what I mean by that is if we're talking about the achievement gap, we're talking about what's been studied is there's a relationship between rising household income and test scores. Okay? And if I went to my professor of sociology and said, Dr. Schutte, I found this relationship and it seems to be very significant, and I think the evidence is there that it is, he'd say, that's great, Jason, I think you did a good job of researching this subject. What else could be causing this particular relationship with test scores besides rising household income? And that evidence is there. When we look at different demographics, we see in Asian households that are poorer Asian households, they are outperforming affluent houses that are not just one, but 3 or 4 brackets ahead of them in different test scores. So there's something else there to be discovered. So I learned a while back to ask the question, what else? Okay, I think it's important. Education, obviously, I've mentioned a little bit about my background because I value it. Okay, and I think it's important to fund things that can close that achievement gap, but I don't think anybody here, I mean, it's great. We want to be leading on this particular issue, but it's never been quite enough for me in my life to say, I'm okay with being a mediocre leader on any particular subject. I think that Wisconsin can be a state that not only closes this gap, but becomes a leader. We ask the question, what else? Right? Because we can provide funding, we can say, well, okay, and you'll see Wisconsin has a great research program in sociology. We can see other schools like Stanford and Berkeley, and yes, more affluent households can provide funding for lessons after school or summer camp or what have you. And while those things are important, something else is there that is allowing other people in poorer households to still achieve. So what else? What is that? I think we have the resources. We have great institutions here in the state of Wisconsin.
In their schooling, it also forces the schools to improve, because if those kids are just assigned to a school, there's no downside to not performing. One of the ways we can also improve education is we need to improve the curriculum. There's a lot of stuff. I've recently finished my master's degree. I can tell you there's, for my bachelor's even, there's a lot of classes that students have to take where the information they're taught is not practical, it's not useful, they're not being taught a lot of things. You go on the internet, you're going to see a lot of young adults making jokes like, yeah, I may not know how to balance my checkbook, my checking account, but thank God I know the Pythagorean theorem. How many of you went, what's the Pythagorean? What is it? You have to remember. How many of you actually used it? Three. May not know anything about politics and government, taxes, and how to pay them, but thank God I know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. How many of you have had that as practical information in your lives?
Yep.
Okay. A minority. But it's being taught to everybody and it's being emphasized. Why? Because it's testable. Sorry, I'm getting a little angry. I just remember one of my college math classes, I had to sit there and do the same formula over and over and over and over again. I remember just thinking back to grade school, how many of us had to do multiplication tables from over and over, the long division, do it by hand. Oh, because you're not going to have a calculator everywhere you go. A lot of that stuff is still going on. And that's what we can change. We can change what we're teaching the kids. We can make it more practical education. It's happening, but they're just kind of tipping their toe in the water, seeing how it's going. We need more basic skills training. We have a lot of shortage in manufacturing jobs, but that training comes after high school. That training should be in high school. We should have more technical training in high schools. That would be a lot better use of those funds. I think that's all. I hope I didn't forget anything, but that's where I stand on education. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. All right, up next, Reese Wood from the 45th Assembly District down in the Beloit area. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Matt. All right, yeah, Beloit, the 45th district is Beloit, Wisconsin, out to Broadhead, Judah, Evansville, some townships in between. I grew up in my district. I went to several of the schools in my district. I now have 4 kids growing up in the district also, with another one on the way. So I'm very familiar with the educational system in the 45th district. And I'm trying to get some input from voters out there campaigning right now. And I'm hearing 2 things. I'm hearing that we need more funding. I'm also hearing that we have plenty of funding. So from the people that I hear we need more funding, I try to paint a picture of Beloit. And the picture in Beloit right now is we have students underachieving in terms of test scores. We also have about 11.95 is the levy limit for the school district. And that means 85% of our school system is being funded by state aid, state and federal aid, mostly state aid. And with that, the Beloit community, another factor that's important is the amount of the budget that the city gets in state aid is about 60%. What we got in Beloit is a lot of state aid. It makes up the majority of our community. And so when we hear that things are being underfunded or that there needs to be more funding, what I hear is there's a lot of confusion. We're trying to find what's the reality. And the people who say there's not enough funding, I'm not so sure if that's an issue. I do wonder about there being enough funding and it not going to the right places. In Beloit, remember there's 85% state aid funding the district. Right now we have students underachieving, yet we're getting a $1 million welcoming center for the school district. Beloit has plenty of school buildings, still older buildings that are just sitting around vacant that could be better utilized. There's a lot of educational buildings in Beloit. There's a lot of opportunity in Beloit for education, yet everything's being underutilized. So how do we find what is the solution? How do we get people who believe there's too much funding not being spent the right way happy, and how do we get people who are saying there's not enough funding happy? It's a real problem, but I think the solution to all this is choice. You know, if we could, like some of the other candidates have said, if we could allow more choice. Well, that's a problem. We really have a challenge there. We have to look at all the mandates and the funding that's tied to the mandates. And with a lot of our currently elected representatives, the voters and the people living throughout these districts are not being heard. And so what we need is to actually, above everything, whether some of these candidates win the race or not, what we need is our elected representatives to really engage with people and really find out what people want. And I think that it's really common sense, right? Representatives should engage with their constituents. But I think we have a lot of lack of engagement going on in our state. And that's up to the communities to really hound on your representative. If you feel that there's too much funding and it's going to the wrong places, talk to your state representative. If you think there's not enough funding, do the same thing. And I think there's not enough people right now currently engaging their state representative regarding the school issues and the educational issues. So the big solution, there's a lot of things we could do if we get elected. But there's one thing we can do whether we get elected or not, and that's keep engaging people. So everybody here, I'm proud to see the faces here. These are all people trying to engage, and that's what we need more of. That's a very simple solution. It doesn't look into legislative proposals, funding, or anything. We just need a little more engagement. So that's one thing, if elected, I'm trying to bring to the legislature, a little more civic engagement, engaging people, and trying to bring that independent voice to our other representatives and say, hey, you guys are really good at talking about funding, you guys are talking about what options should be on the table, but we're not engaging people. The representatives themselves, most of the times, are just running with the issues, running with the solutions, and it's not really a public agenda. So that's all I really have, guys. I appreciate everybody coming here today, and thanks, Matt.
All right, thank you, Reese. That was excellent. Next up is the Libertarian candidate for Wisconsin for Lieutenant Governor here in Wisconsin, Patrick Baird.
Thank you, Matt. One thing I hope those of you who are not libertarians or maybe don't have a lot of experience with libertarians come away understanding we're a pretty diverse bunch. Any group of people, you get them together, you're going to find a certain amount of diversity within that group. For instance, there are many libertarians who would like to get rid of public schools altogether. They don't believe that we should take money from one person or one group of people and use it to benefit other groups of people. I'm not in that group. I'm on the opposite side of the spectrum. I'm actually a supporter of public schools. Both of my parents were public school teachers. Matter of fact, on my dad's side, almost all my uncles and aunts were public school teachers and librarians. I come from a family where education was extremely important. It was central in our lives. I was obviously a graduate of public schools, went to public schools all my life. And my children, I was a 14-year resident of Greendale, right here around the corner. My kids grew up, spent all their youth in Greendale, went to Greendale Public Schools, got a fine education from the Greendale Public School District. It's a good school district. So I remain, even though I progressed further into being a libertarian over the course of the last few years, I still remain a supporter of public schools. But my views have changed somewhat. And I've always believed that in the mission of a public school system was that it was one of the important democratizing institutions in our society. I believed in the ideal that if everyone went to the same school, rich and poor, black and white, immigrant, native, whatever it may be, if everyone went to the same school and learned the same lessons elbow to elbow, that would build a better civic society for America. I believed in that, and I still believe in that to some degree. But what I've come to understand over the years, and let me give you a little background. Not only was I a parent of public school kids, When I lived in Greendale, I spent some time, part-time, as a reporter for a chain of community newspapers. I covered school boards. I was here in the southwestern part of Milwaukee County. A few years later, when I moved, I lived up north, in a small town up north, I did the same thing. I covered school boards and city councils up in that part of the country. So I got to see how school districts, school boards worked up close. I learned about things like school lunch. It's a fascinating subject. You'd think that school lunch would be a base. It's a fascinating thing. You can have amazing arguments about the school lunch program. I learned so many things. But, so from all of that perspective, and then getting a little further into libertarian politics and activism, I came to see things a little differently. Two things that I learned in that process. The first thing was, by covering all these different school boards, and it's a very different experience in one school district versus another, especially when you're talking about a more rural area where you have small towns versus suburbs. But even here, in this part of Milwaukee County, the suburbs, there's quite some degree of difference between communities. And that was the key thing that I learned, is that every community is a little bit different when it comes to public schools. My favorite anecdote that I like to give is when I lived up north, there were two school districts, two small towns that were side by side. And the one school district had a really good educational reputation. They had a public school system that sent a lot of kids to college. They had good athletic programs, but it wasn't the focus of the school district. It was just a good place if you were a young parent and you wanted to find a place in that area to settle and buy a house. That was a good area if you valued your kids' education. And that community was not afraid to support spending on schools. They approved referendums for building new high schools, that sort of thing. Next door was another school district. The schools weren't that good. Parents didn't seem to care. What they cared about was building a new football stadium. That was really important. They were not, they put together a big fund. They raised, to their credit, they raised half the funds they raised through private donations, but the other half, of course, came from taxpayers. And that passed. They built themselves a nice new football stadium. They were like Division III, and they were never a powerhouse football team. I don't know why it was so important, but for whatever reason, that was what that community valued. And that taught me a lesson. That taught me a lesson that if you believe in democracy, then you should believe in the ability of people to make dumb choices. And that's kind of stuck with me. And it's led me to think about public schools in a different way. I no longer saw public schools as the ideal democratizing institution that I thought it was, because another thing that happened is, over the last, and this has happened over the last 10 years, we've seen people self-segregating themselves geographically in this country. In other words, if you're a more well-off Republican and somewhat conservative in your politics, you're going to go move to someplace like Brookfield or Grafton or somewhere like that, where you're going to live alongside of people who are more like you, probably professional, higher income. You want your kids to go to good schools. You're willing to support that, but you are self-segregating into a community that's more homogenous, versus people who might be more liberal. They might go to some other suburbs, like let's say Shorewood or Whitefish Bay, where they're going to live alongside of people that have point of views that are similar to theirs. They also have money, so they also probably are able to spend on public schools as well. But so this democratization idea has kind of been corrupted by this self-segregation that we've done as a country. So people are no longer, the poor are no longer living in the same communities, unless you're talking about a small town. There's a handful of small towns in Wisconsin where this is still true, perhaps. But for the most part, the poor live here, the rich live here, the white live here, the black live here. Everybody lives separate. They have their own separate schools. And in some cases, that's led to disparities, obviously. We're all familiar with the problems of Milwaukee Public Schools, for instance. Beloit has similar problems. Madison, to a lesser degree, has similar problems. But what covering local school boards and seeing how school boards operated, a couple of things. Number one, it made me realize just how influential one or two people can be in a community. If you can get on a lot of school boards are, I call them school fans. It's like 8 people on the school board and they all think the schools are great, the principal's great, the superintendent, he's brilliant, he's a genius, everything the school does is great. Rubber stamp, rubber stamp, rubber stamp, rubber stamp. They just, you know, whatever the superintendent wants and the principals want, they get. If you're one person, and you're a cranky old libertarian, and you don't like spending a lot of money, and you want taxes to stay low, and you get on that school board, you mess the whole thing up. You screw the whole project up because you're the one guy that's always saying, wait a minute, hold on here. Let's look at this. Let's not just rush to judgment on this. Let's actually talk about this. You start bringing up arguments, and it messes the whole project up. So that was one thing I learned. Local offices are one area where 1 or 2 people can get involved and make a big difference in how things happen. But I also came to appreciate that it is okay for different communities to have different values and different priorities. I look at public schools now as an opportunity for a community to make a decision. And I'm not gonna, and I think it's perfectly valid to make a decision either way. A community can say, you know what, we're gonna invest money in our public schools, and we're gonna use our public schools to promote our community and to try to get people to come here and live here. Young people to come and buy a house, raise their kids in this community, invest in the community. That's perfectly valid. If that's what the community wants to do, then that's a great idea. If, on the other hand, the community, maybe they're a little older, or the demographics are different, or maybe they just are not big fans of public school. Maybe they have very strong parochial schools in that community. They can say, you know what, we're not gonna do that. We're not gonna make the big investment in our schools. We're gonna, you know, not focus on that. We're not gonna approve all these spending referendums. That's fine. Then you've made that choice, and then your community will embrace other values, which is okay. So when Phil and I decided to run for governor and lieutenant governor, we talked about these issues, and we both agreed that local control is really important. That a lot of the problems that are, and Kirsten and Jeff are going to do a great job here in a few minutes, telling you all the problems that come with money from Washington and money from Madison, and why that's a bad thing. So local school districts, in our opinion, ought to have maximum freedom to do whatever they feel is right for their community and for their kids in their schools. So that's a very key component. And within that, I personally believe that the public schools can be a part of that. But I've also come to understand that there are a lot of people who don't necessarily want their kids stuck and trapped in public schools. And as a libertarian, I have to honor that choice. I have to say, look, if schools are imparting values to your kids that you don't agree with and that are troublesome to you, your kids shouldn't be forced to sit in that classroom and have to have that happen to them. You should, as a parent, have the opportunity to have them educated in a different way. Whether it's a parochial school, whether it's homeschooling, I think that parents should have that choice. Phil's going to give you here in a minute a breakdown of our plan for schools, which will include options for greater choice. But I still want to just let people know that, yes, we support the idea of supporting people who want to have their kids educated, parochial schools, homeschoolers. One of the things I think is terrible that the government does, it tries, of all things, homeschooling should be 100% independent of interference from outside. The government is constantly trying to get them, the nose of the camel under the tent into homeschooling. As a libertarian, I object to that strongly. I think that homeschoolers ought to be left alone. But I also believe that if it's a community-based and community-supported public school system, that should be part of the mix too. that if a community wants to devote resources to schools, they should be free to do that. If that reflects the values of their communities, that's what they should be able to do. But at the same time, they should have maximum freedom from interference from above in pursuing whatever types of school programs are important to them. What you're teaching kids in Milwaukee, every kid needs a certain basic similar things, but how you're teaching and what you're teaching kids in Milwaukee cannot be the same as what you teach kids in Rhinelander or Beloit or Wausau. And, you know, every community is different, so every community ought to have that freedom. But I just wanted to say, to kind of go against the tide a little bit here today, and say I still do believe in public schools, but I think they need to be part of a bigger picture with more options, more choice, and that's what we're pushing for here in our campaign. So, thanks. Any questions? Yes?
Do churches pay property taxes or income taxes?
I don't believe that they do.
So the money that they use for the education that they have comes from?
The tuition, and I would assume from their diocese.
Okay, so they aren't forced to pay, like, they don't have to pay property taxes, they don't pay income taxes, so whatever money they get from the people who go to their church, that money is theirs to keep.
Yes.
Unless, I will add this, unless they accept voucher dollars, in which case they are taking public monies to enable the students to come to their private dollars.
I understand that part.
Yeah.
I was just meant from their own coffers, where are they getting the money? The money that, so if they have to take money for vouchers, if they get money from the state or whoever they get it, for voucher school, are they saying they don't have enough money to educate their kids? They're not having the bills go out the same as the public schools do?
Well, let me answer that question. I think what you're getting at is why are tax dollars going to private schools? Is that your concern?
In a manner of speaking, yes, because they're not paying taxes, but they're getting tax money in. So
Right.
it seems out of balance.
Right. But the parents who send their kids to those schools, they are paying taxes.
Yes,
They are paying those property taxes, and they're not getting any benefit from that. If they send their kids, or if they homeschool, they're not getting any benefit from the property taxes that they're required to pay. So one of the things that, and Phil will talk about this in some more detail, one of the things we're in favor of is allowing parents to take at least some of the money that they pay in taxes with them wherever their kids are educated, whether it's a public schools, private schools, homeschooling, whatever it may be. And that's a matter of helping with having more choice and more freedom for parents in their communities. It's done.
You know, talking about, I'm not sure you said whether they pay income tax. I work for a religious organization, the Lutheran Home, and we paid, you know, state tax. We had FICA taken out. We had Medicare taken out. So employees.
Sure, you pay sales tax, of course.
Sure, employees in the churches, yeah.
But the
And
churches
I know some religious organizations, private organizations, if they don't pay taxes, they have what they call pilot pay in lieu of taxes, that they pay some of that. And you brought up about the school board. I'm a former alderman. I was also on the school board in Greenfield, and you know, one person can make a difference. And when I ran, I had two goals that I put forth. One, of course, was to make sure the kids had quality educational opportunities. The second one is to look out for the taxpayers and the ability of the taxpayers to pay, you know, their taxes. So one of the reasons I got elected is six of the seven people on the school board voted for, in 2009, voted for an 11.2% increase in the tax levy. It was voted on, which is advisory at the annual meeting, voted down by the voters, and they went ahead with that anyways, without trying to cut spending or trying to use some of their reserve fund. So
Yeah.
I think, and one person, you know, can make a difference. That's why for like 20 years I've been encouraging libertarians and others to run for local office. For one thing, that's one where you can actually get elected and you can then make a difference. Or even if you're not elected, Brad Sponholtz, who's also a libertarian, and I are on the planning commission for the city of Greenfield, we get our views out there, pro-business, and, you know, watch out for the spending and stuff
Right.
like that, and property rights.
So,
and-
so let me ask you, Don, has it been your experience that people like you who are kind of budget hawks, who are objecting to higher taxation and trying to keep a lid on spending, are you in the minority almost all the time on the local level?
I would say, you know, when I was on the school board, well, there were about 4 of us that were actually on there that were,
Four out of how many?
4 out of 7 at the time, you know, but we were reasonable. Like I've brought out many times, I've been on the council and the school board. I know people, some were Democrats, some were Republicans. You know, I and another guy were libertarians on the board, but we all worked together to get things done.
Right.
I think there needs to be more of that, but it was always looking out for the taxpayer.
But that's the thing, is that if you don't even, if you are concerned about spending and taxation, if you don't get involved, it will devolve often to where literally 100% of the council or 100% of the school board will be made up of people who are happy to continue to spend money and raise taxes. So that is a default, really.
And then another thing I'd like to point out, I was on the Greenfield School Board. I think we have good schools. I think there's a good curriculum and good opportunities, but it's up to the children, especially and their parents, with the help of the teachers and that, to take advantage of it. And unfortunately, a lot of the kids and a lot of the parents don't take advantage of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was gonna say that, watching the text out, I don't know if there are people who don't watch the text out. I watch it, he watches it. The problem I see is something that one of you mentioned not too long ago about the money not getting to where it's supposed to go, or overabundance of administrators that you don't need, or buildings that are empty that you aren't using. And so the money gets squandered in a lot of ways that it's not used wisely in any method. And I'm a teacher, by the way, just so you know.
Sure.
I have some background in this. And I've seen money squandered. I had a computer in my room for 2 years with no software. I mean, hopefully, how's that gonna help? So, and I've seen administrators who don't know their job. They don't know what they're doing. I see principals who do not know how to be principals. They can't keep their teachers together. I've
Well,
seen.
you fired one place and they get a new job at the next place down the road.
Exactly. Yes, and I've seen that a lot. I haven't seen as many bad teachers as I've seen as bad administrators, but of course I've seen some bad teachers. I mean, that's
Well,
goes without saying.
let me say that.
But administrators, the administrators are administrating many people all at one time, and you get blocked from doing things you know are right because of somebody in administration.
It's language and innovation, you can't teach to it in class.
Right,
You teach
yes,
what you-
exactly. And I found that out a number of times. And someone you think has a doctorate degree, or this guy's gonna be really good, not necessarily. Good book learner, but not good common sense wise. And so when people, you know, when you're talking about the school, you have to really talk about a lot of things. It's not just a simple, oh, let's give them more money or take away the money or something like that. It's not that simple. And I wonder, like John said he was on the school board. I've never been on a school board because I've been the teacher, so I've not been there. And I should actually run.
You should.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Because I don't know how much people on the school board know about school.
A lot of them don't. A lot of them are.
So they're not very versed in what's going on
Yes.
and I never saw them in our schools very often. I never saw a school board member, you know, checking out the school to see how it was really working, or talking with teachers to see what their concepts were of what was going on. So I'll shut up now.
I'll just say this, you know, we need people like Jason. Jason, who has a background in budgeting and finance. You're right, there are some people that get elected to school boards and they really don't, they're not teachers, they don't have any background in education, they're not business people. They just love the schools and they want to support the schools, which is fine. But let me say one thing, and then I'll move on to let Phil step up here. Every year, your school district puts out a budget in the spring, and every citizen has an opportunity to take a look at that budget document, and you can see exactly what they're planning on spending, or what they have been spending their money on. And it's, you know, it's not that hard to go in there and pick some things out and find things that maybe, why are they spending $27,000 on travel this year? That was one of my favorite things I always looked for. You know, why are they making this expenditure up? We just bought laptops 2 years ago. Why are we buying more laptops 2 years later to replace the ones we bought 2 years ago? So, you know, there's a lot of ways, even if you don't run for school board, if you just go to the meetings every now and then, especially the meetings in the spring when they're talking about the budget. And here's the thing they do every year. This is one thing one of my editors told me early on. He said, every spring they lay off teachers. We're going to have to get rid of the football program if we don't get a 5% increase in our budget next year. We're going to lay off 10 teachers. And then they don't get their 5% increase and they lay off 5 teachers. And lo and behold, come September, 4 of those teachers have been rehired, and the one that didn't get rehired was going to move anyway. So it's a game they play every year to try to scare voters into spending more money. Just going to the school board meetings, and especially going to the meetings around budget time, it really can do a wonder for getting involved in your community and helping to hold them accountable and improve your school. So plug for public schools before Kirsten comes in here and talks about what's wrong with public schools. She's got wonderful things to say. She does. And she's right about everything. But I just wanted to say one positive thing about public schools. I hope we can have better public schools in this state going forward. So thanks, everybody.
That was excellent. That's what we wanted from this forum, is to engage everybody, probably some different points of view. So that's excellent. And we're going to kind of keep it rolling here because I'd like to get to Kristen and Jeff because they have a wonderful presentation. So we have 2 candidates left, and we'll get it rolling. We're going to start with Phil Anderson, the Libertarian candidate for state governor.
We are running a little bit more time, so I'll be relatively brief. The details of our education platform, which coincidentally were helped in composing it by Kirsten and Jeff, who are presenting today, to their credit. And I'll tell you why that's important in just a second. But it's on our website, teamgov, teamguv.org/education or something. It's right on the website. I became a libertarian officially about 6 years ago because I love the idea that our party stands for principles that are basically timeless. That you can take our belief that people have the right to live their lives as they choose and apply it to pretty much any issue, and you come up with a solution, which works great for a lot of things. But one of the things that we fight against, all of us libertarians on every issue, is this worldview that people are taught, probably in public schools, but in other places too, that there's a right and a left, that there's a conservative and a liberal, that there's all these things that we have to choose from. We stand outside of that because we don't flow with the times. We don't just decide how we're going to vote on a particular issue based on what's expedient or what our constituents want. We stick with principles. So that in essence creates a problem. One of the problems for us too is that sometimes there are issues that come up, education is one of them, where the public has such an ingrained mindset about how they're talking about it that it's difficult to even enter into the conversation. We hear a lot of candidates talking about, a lot of politicians, a lot of people talking about, I support good public schools. Well, of course, who wouldn't support good public schools? Some people say, I support public schools. As a matter of fact, Patrick and I were at a candidate forum put on by the Milwaukee Urban League Young Professionals Group just this last week, where one of his opponents for lieutenant governor said, I support public schools. And he's from Milwaukee, and he's talking to people from Milwaukee, which has a terrible public school system. And the people clapped. So what sort of sense does that make? It doesn't make any sense. And the room was largely African American. They're the worst served demographic in the state, in the education system, and in Milwaukee in particular. Yet they're clapping for a candidate who says, I support public schools. That really makes it not an easy thing for us libertarians who largely are not necessarily against public schools, but uncomfortable with the idea that people are forced to pay for a system that they're then incentivized to send their kids to, and sort of expected to by their friends and family to do that, otherwise they're seen as kooky or not doing a good job raising their kids.
And that may not be working for them.
And right, well, of course. So in approaching that discussion, a few months ago, I was thinking about how do we solve this issue? As a libertarian, it would be easy for me to say, we should just get rid of the public school system, and you'll hear that a lot, but that's not realistic. It's there, it exists, people are depending on it, and there are places where kids get a good education. But what we need to do is separate the issues of what's good and what's public, and follow that with the understanding that the public is paying for these schools. We're all paying for these schools. We look at property taxes as support for public schools, and we think about property tax as something that homeowners pay or business owners pay, but renters pay it too, in the form of their rent. Everyone's paying for this. So then we give that money to the government, and it filters through federal and state and gets all these strings attached to it, and everything comes back, and here's your public schools, people, like it or leave it. And you really don't have a choice unless you have the means to go outside of it and have the wherewithal and the backbone to go outside of that system and do anything about it. So what I decided, and what Patrick helped me put together, and Kirsten and Jeff helped me put together, was our program for education, which is basically an open enrollment, universal open enrollment. Now, if you don't have kids or haven't had kids in school, open enrollment is currently something that you can use if you have your kids in one district, but there's room for them in another, and you can move them to a different district. But the key part of that is that there's a dollar amount attached to that. So there's a formula that says, if you have your kids in one school district and moving to another, then the funds move with them so that the next school district can support them. What I propose, and what we propose, is that money, which it's been paid by taxpayers. It's not the government. Well, they do sort of print it in some cases, but it's not the money. It's not the government's money. It's money that you all have paid, that we all have paid for kids to go to school. And we have the right to choose as parents. You have the right to choose as parents and as consumers of education where that should go. So you should get that money back in some way, shape, or form, and then choose what's best for your kids. And if your kids, if you're paying taxes, which everyone is, and you want to choose a different school, whether that's a private school or homeschooling or whatever you decide, you should have access to the money that you've already paid in to take that money elsewhere. And that seems so common sense, but in flying into the face of the public, and especially the political public, who talk about education in terms of public or choice, both flawed, it's very difficult to get that point across, but that's what we stand for. Another part of and I'm sure this is going to be covered, is I'm running against two people, Tony Evers and Scott Walker, who are responsible for the mess, particularly in Milwaukee, but in other parts of the state, of the public school system, the flaws, the problems. One is the governor, and one is the head of the Department of Public Instruction. And they're both competing with this, that they're the education governor. One on, I support the teachers union. Of course, he doesn't say it that way, but Tony Evers, of course, is a product of the teachers union and is supported by school teachers, and as he supports public schools to the exclusion of all other options, pretty much. And Scott Walker, who supports school choice. But what kind of school choice does he support? The school choice that Scott Walker has in place is with strings attached. So if you take those vouchers, if you're fortunate enough to be a part of the voucher program, and you want to spend that at your private school that you went and visited and you fall in love with it, the only way that they can accept that is if they follow basically Common Core standards, which are dictated from the U.S. Department of Education, which has only existed since 1980, and education has gone downhill ever since. So how are either of these gentlemen that I'm running against have any credentials or any credibility in terms of education, in terms of freedom, in terms of people being able to decide rightfully that their kids should have this kind of education as opposed to this kind with the money that they've already paid in? That's the false choice that's given to the people of Wisconsin, that's given to you. And that's what we want to break through. So despite my philosophical problems with the public schools, they exist. But the way I think to show people who have been so indoctrinated into this idea of public or choice, or right or left, or Tony or Scott, or bipartisan, or either party, or both parties, and all these ways that people talk that only have two options, both of which are bad. The way that we combat this is just by giving people a choice with their own money. You take your money, the school district already decided how much that is, $1,800, $2,000, $2,500 a year, whatever it is. You take that money and you choose the best school for your kid. No strings attached. You decide. Don't let them decide, because it's all political and corrupt. You decide. We'll get rid of we'll not accept federal aid for education so that those strings aren't attached. We'll encourage local control, which Patrick mentioned. That's a theme of our campaign that pretty much covers every single issue. Local communities should decide how they want their schools to be. If they decide that they want to go all in on public schools, fine. You can move if you don't like it. And it's not that hard to move. You can, if your community decides they want to not support public schools at all and support some sort of private school system or some combination or whatever, great. Go to your school board meeting, go to your city council meeting, your county board meeting, get involved, help make those decisions, whatever is right for you and your family. And lastly, there's an issue of privacy. One of the hidden aspects of Common Core and all the strings attached is how the data is shared. So if you have kids in public schools or did, their test scores, their information is all accessible up the chain, the state and federal level. You might not have known that, but that's part of this, how the strings are attached too. And that information is gathered by the federal government, and are we sure that we trust what they're doing with that data? Right now, on a side note, with all the hubbub that's going on about the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings and all the controversy surrounding that is, Congress is considering re-upping the Patriot Act, which of course is a huge, among the things that it does, is a huge infringement on our data privacy and the way that the government handles our personal information. So, in a nutshell, you can go to our website, see the entire platform on education, but the main principle that I'd like to point out is, again, is that you have the right to decide with your dollars what's best for your kids in your school system, in your local communities. There's no other person, no other entity, no other majority, no other democracy that has a right to say that you don't have that you don't have the right to make that decision for your kids. And whether it's our platform, if I'm elected, or something that's presented to me by Democrats, Republicans, whoever, that's the principle that I'll look at that legislation to decide whether to sign it, whether to get out the old pen and use the line item veto, whatever it might be, to modify that to make that fit best according to that principle. You have the right, not them, not anyone else, and that's what I stand for. Thanks.
All right, we have one last candidate, and I'm glad that he came. He's a Republican. His name is Jason Red Arnold, and he's running for Senate District Number 7 here in the Milwaukee area. So, Jason, thank you for coming.
Thank you. Call me Red. I haven't told my mom I'm not really fond of the name Jason, but that's one of the reasons I should go by Red. It's the same reason I wore this, because remember what that guy was saying? You know that guy? You can just, yeah, the guy in the bright green. So it's on purpose. It's a sales technique. I used to be in sales. I am a Republican, but in a lot of ways I'm a libertarian. And I do agree with both of you that schools should be public. They're in society. We should have certain things. Taxes are a must for roads, police, fire, school, parks, military. That's about it though. So we've really gone away from that. And of course we've got our TVs and our iPads, and we don't really pay attention anymore to what government is doing, because we'll just kind of let them do that. And it's only when something bad happens that we lift our head up and we complain. And usually by that time it's too late. For example, you guys were talking about those referendums. South Milwaukee actually just had one where I went to the high school there, and the junior high used to be right by the Dairy Queen on Hawthorne. Been there for, since the 50s? No kid ever got hit, but yet now all of a sudden, well, we might need a little crosswalk here on Oak Street. So they allocated, and it was 6-1, $14,300 to study, to pay Ayers or whoever, I'm sure it was, the friend of the engineer, Ayers to study whether or not we need to do something there. Not to actually do something there, to study whether or not we want to do something there. One guy asked, where'd you come up with the number? It was never answered. And another, New London, they have 2 railroad tracks, and they allocated $118,562 to repair those railroad tracks. And one of the reporters, I think it was Matt Kittle from Watchdog, he said, isn't that the responsibility of one of the councilmen says, isn't that the responsibility of the railroad company? It was never answered, and it passed. They looked it up. Matt Kittle called the Railroad Commission, and they said, yeah, that's our responsibility. Yet they still allocated the money. Where did it go? Okay? This is the kind of stuff we need to pay attention to. And again, it all happens at the local level. Now imagine what happens at the state level. My big 3 issues are direct primary care, which you guys should all go to my website, vote Red Arnold, donate $20. Watch my 43-minute video on direct primary care, because even if Obamacare doesn't get repealed, there's a loophole in Obamacare, section 1301A3, that allows for this. No government intervention is needed, but we can help this along. But $2 a day on average, 95% of your health care can be covered. So if that kind of raises your eyebrows, ooh, that sounds good. Yes, it is good. So that's what needs to be spread so that we can actually get this going. And it was, it passed the Assembly to be the foundation for Medicaid, Medicare in Wisconsin, but failed where everything else fails in the Senate. The second issue is Department of Transportation. Obviously, that's a mess. Right over here on Layton, one of the reasons I was late. All this construction, yet they do it all over again. They tear it up the next year, and it's almost like forming Voltron for those of you kids who are products of the 80s, or the Care Bear stare. The Care Bear's getting to the huddle. What are we gonna do? And it's always the same thing, the Care Bear stare. So it's always the same thing. Oh, now we need to do sewer laterals, or oh, now we need to do the grading, or oh, now we need to redo the wiring, you know, on the crosswalks. Aside from the blatant corruption, which actually last night the Journal Sentinel had an article about they overpaid. They just double bill overpaid. Oh, sorry, we'll retract that. And then it got paid again. This is just absolute blatant thievery. Even though it's not technically illegal according to the way the bureaucracy has written it, and according to the way the laws go. And I actually talked to the Attorney General about this. And it's essentially like taking food out of the cart of the person at the grocery store. That's not illegal, but you don't do it. So the third issue, of course, is education. And like I said, I agree with you guys that it should be public, but yes, we should have choice. We should have private schools, and unfortunately, all the strings are attached, and Common Core is still there. Everyone thinks it's gone, and it's not. So that definitely needs to be addressed, and we really need to defang the DPI, whether Evers is there or not, because somebody else is going to be in there. And I don't understand. I have yet to get to the bottom in the years that I've been involved in the Republican Party, why in the hell we don't back, like Lowell Holtz was a perfect candidate, and they sat on their thumbs and did this. But same thing with Leah Vukmir even. Now all of a sudden, and this is hearsay, but she's not getting the help that she needs. Why are we doing that? Why are we even, as a party, doing, and this is not anything for you guys in the Libertarian Party, but then why are we fighting? Why are we doing this at all? So leadership needs to change, because I guarantee you two things. If I'm not elected, in Walker Cage, we will have gas taxes, and in 2020, we will lose everything, because they're going to say, well, the Republicans raise taxes, Democrats raise taxes, and Democrats at least give away free stuff. So everything we worked so hard for is gone. All that surplus that we built up is going to be spent like drunken sailors. I know, because I do it. So that's something to watch out for. And the other thing is toll roads. You will get toll roads, and they will magically be in Assembly District 63 or Senate District 13. Right on 94, right near Foxconn, right where the leadership just happens to be. So watch out for that. And I hate being right, but I'm always right. It's a curse. And like I said, it's yeah. So I'm trying to keep it brief. So I do want to hear your presentation. It's good to see you again. Yeah, so that's kind of my campaign in a nutshell. That's where I stand on things. And I'm not really afraid to bring the claws out. Matter of fact, if you actually go on Twitter, I've been banned twice. I thought I was going to be banned a third time, but no, I'm perfectly willing to play their game. I know a lot of politicians are. I'm perfectly fine with rolling on the ground in the dirt. In fact, I had a little saying, I can go solo, I can walk under a swamp alligator with my hat on and not so much as tickle his nutty bits. So that's me. If you guys have any questions, by all means, send me an email. It's voteredarnold.com. Watch that video on direct primary care. And of course, if you'd, like I said, like to support, throw 20 bucks in an envelope, mail it to, it's right there on my campaign website. Donate on PayPal, and help these candidates out too, because again, change starts with you guys, but we need to get that message out. That's the key. So we team up, do it together, it'll work. So hope that answers anybody's questions.
All right, thank you, Jason. Like I said, we sent invites out to Republicans, Democrats. And I'll put it bluntly, most of them did not respond. And the ones that did, I got the email saying, I gotta check my schedule, and no further emails after that. But like I said, what we wanted to do is we wanted to bring perspective from all the political sides so that voters like you and everybody else in the crowd can make an informed decision on what somebody believes in, as opposed to, oh, hey, I'm just gonna vote Democrat because I think Democrats do this. Well, not all Democrats are the same, just like not all Republicans are the same, and just like Patrick was saying, not all Libertarians are the same. So you gotta get to know your candidates personally, and I just wanted the opportunity so you guys could do that. What I also want to do is I want to bring somebody from the outside of the political arena to explain some of the issues facing Wisconsin education. Originally, we were supposed to have Dr. DuPesta, but he injured his knee and had surgery today. So we were scrambling, and I'm thankful for Phil for introducing us to our next speakers. And I can't thank them enough for the short notice. I really can't. And coming in and helping us out and exposing your guys' activism and your research and to all of us so we can all learn together. Kristen Lombard and Jeff Horn. Thank you.
I am Kirsten Lombard, and this is my husband, Jeff Horn. One of the ways that we got some of the great perspective that we got on education, we've been activists in the education arena for 6 or 7 years now. And in 2013, we decided to reach across the aisle, literally across the entire political spectrum, to activists and experts who we respected of all political stripes and ideologies. And we put together a book of 18 essays by those people that we reached out to. It's literally left, right, middle, everybody that you can think of, everybody from hard left, social conservative, libertarians, voluntarists, you name it. So this is how we got a lot of the amazing perspective that we got, is by talking to literally everybody that we could get our hands on and getting their perspective. Everybody in this book is universally agreed that Common Core is a bad idea. Today we're going to tell you a little bit about not really so much Common Core, but where Common Core fits into a larger sort of overarching paradigm of education, which is workforce development, education for workforce development. A lot of you may have heard of it referred to as school to work. Sometimes you hear terms like outcome-based education. These are all terms that are very much tied together, but the term that's primarily being used now is education for workforce development. So let's plow through. We've got a lot of information. We may have to blow through or over some things very quickly, but we're going to give you the essentials. So, including a take on both Tony Evers and Scott Walker today. So I don't know if any of you have read the Alice in Wonderland books, but in Alice Through the Looking Glass, there's a moment at the beginning of the book where Alice she runs into the Red Queen, who's a chess figure. And this chess figure wants to take her somewhere, and she grabs Alice by the hand, and they start running and running and running and running and running and running and running to the point where Alice is totally out of breath. And finally, when they stop, Alice realizes, they're in the same place that they were when they started running. And the Red Queen says to her, like sort of nonplussed that Alice doesn't get this already, she says, "Here, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that." Well, since 1965, we have been doing education reform after education reform after education reform. And not only has it not gotten us further in education, it's actually set us back. So that's the situation we're in today. I always like to kind of use this as an illustration. Okay, honey. So we can't solve the problem if we don't know its root causes, and so we're going to start to look at those a little bit. Some questions that we're going to cover today: what is the current education tonic? What are its origins? Who and or what is manufacturing it? Could more school choice help? And where do we go from here? Let's start out with the purpose of education. For that, I'm going to hand the microphone over to my husband.
We are a little pressed for time, but I wondered if anyone might tell me what you think the purpose of education is. Anyone out there?
a more well-rounded citizen.
More well-rounded citizen. That certainly put out a lot of time. Anyone else?
Reading, writing, arithmetic.
Okay. So what I'd like to posit is that, well, here in Wisconsin, we must educate the workforce, and that's really what education is about.
That's what it's become.
That's what it's become. You'll hear things like this: we need to compete in the global marketplace. Hear that a lot. Employers can't find skilled workers anymore, or we have to ensure future opportunities. Is this what education is about? Do you think that's nothing I heard here, but that's what most of the politicians on each of the main parties will tell you. I would posit that what education should be is to impart eternal truths and principles to people, and then to give them some tools to manipulate those for use in their own lives.
And when we say eternal, we're talking about things that will always be true.
Yeah, I don't necessarily mean religious.
In a spiritual sense, yeah.
What I mean by eternal are things like
2 and 2 is 4.
2 and 2 is 4, things like the Pythagorean theorem you heard about before, things about all men are created equal, you know, that we have rights to life, liberty, and property, things like that. And then tools like learning your arithmetic facts, like how to add, how to multiply. Tools like how to put a sentence together, how to communicate well with the rest of your community and society. And that would involve what a noun is and what a verb is. Those are all eternal truths. We can go on. So if education is mostly about getting a job, like it seems to become here in Wisconsin, and we'll be showing you the candidates saying that, then really education is about what's called here in Wisconsin workforce development.
All right.
So,
Go ahead.
yeah, so what's workforce development? It's really training components, mechanisms, and programs leveraged for the purpose of supplying workers for economic development schemes. So it's really economic development schemes, and economic development is not economic growth. So when a candidate says they're for economic development, they're not just saying, we just want the economy to get better. It's a very specific thing. It's not open, free, or voluntary markets. So if they say they're for economic development, they're not saying they're for the free market. Rather, it's a creation of controlled or private markets in the service of a planned, managed, and centralized economy that will benefit the few at the expense of many. And I'd actually say not just controlled or private markets, it's actually rigged markets. Okay, that the people that are participating in the economic development program have a significant advantage, a great advantage over the rest of us and the rest of the economy. So workforce development has essentially used education for these purposes. It forms, trains, sorts, labels, slots, and supply human capital. Okay, the economy runs on people. Like a lot of us would like to think that education is at the service of children, at the service of families, but they are not the customer of education any longer. If you think about it, they are the actual product that's being produced for the economy. So in order to do this, in order to accomplish this goal, to make human capital, and this is what they actually call it. The University of Wisconsin has a department studying human capital. People in industry will call it human capital. Used to call it human resources, but we've gotten a little bit more blatant about capital. In order to do that, training has to replace true academics with low-level skills training. So it has to actually replace things that we might consider more practical, but they're less eternal. Like if I teach you how to
Operate a drill press.
That might be good for you right now, but that may be replaced. You may be replaced by a robot, a cheaper worker, We may not no longer need drill presses, lasers, I don't know what, but that's not an eternal truth, something you'll always be able to take the same way a lot of the eternal truths are.
And I would just add, once you are replaced by a different form of technology or another worker or whatever, then what do you do? If you don't have these eternal truths and you can't reconfigure your life with the eternal truths that you should have been handed, then what do you do? What do you do? That's a problem.
It emphasizes utilitarian learning, so any subject that doesn't have an immediate use is put down a notch or two as not as important. It undermines free thought, because when people are looking for workers, they're not necessarily looking for people to come up with a new idea. They're looking for people to do what they're told. It discourages independent action for the same reason. People must follow the rule, do what they're expected to do. It standardizes thoughts, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors so that we can take you in this job, and if we need you over there, we can easily put you over there, because you or the student is now a standardized component. It rewards compliance, and it guts self-determination.
And what are we supposed to be able to, if we have a right as human beings to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness or property, however you want to put it, that means we have to be able to choose our own future, to guide our own lives. If we can't do that, what are we? We're really just tools or pawns in somebody else's scheme.
So essentially what it's reduced students to is just another product. It sees education as, in some sense, a factory or a supply chain, part of a supply chain that's just taking students from one side and delivering them to employers as the demand. I want to point out this graphic is not something we made. This comes out of a CESA 6 presentation from the part of the Department of Education.
Advocating precisely this.
Yeah, they weren't talking that this was a bad thing. They were touting this as an excellent advance in their education system.
And asking community leaders, people who, business community leaders, all sorts of folks who had money to support with their dollars, with their campaign investments, all sorts of other stuff, this precise model of education.
This is also a graphic from a CESA 6, not the title, but the graphic below it comes from a CESA 6 presentation. And I just show this to just show you that Common Core state standards, which is this red puzzle piece here, is being seen as a key piece right in the middle of taking students from one side and delivering them to the employer skill demands. It is a linchpin piece that actually allows testing to gather information from the students, ranking, to rank them about how well they comply with what they're supposed to be doing on that test, and sorts them, and allows employers to determine the skills that those students have. I also want to point out that those skills are not skills even in the sense that you and I might think of them. A lot of this testing is also testing social and emotional, psychological, psychometric type things that might show an employer might be interested in seeing about a potential employee.
Is this person a leader? Are they a follower? Is this person highly suggestible, or are they more stubborn? Are they more obstinate? There's all sorts of psychometrics. When you look at when you look at most of the standardized testing that is done today with students, it is almost all aiming at gathering psychometric information, not so much academic information. The academics are literally a thin layer of glue over the top. It's a veneer in order to make it look acceptable to be gathering this information.
What's Perkins legislation?
What's that?
The
Perkins legislation.
Perkins legislation has to do with monies that are provided to students for education at the college level. So.
some of the enabling legislation about student loans and some grants, some federal grants. for college.
And to also, to be clear, college and career readiness also does not mean what you think. It sounds great, but all over the place in education today, you're seeing terms being used very deceptively. It sounds like one thing to you and I, but when you dig down into what the people who design that term actually mean, and they have spent literally millions of dollars to develop these terms so that they will resonate for you and I, it becomes clear that college and career readiness simply means being the kind of citizen and worker that somebody else wants you to be. Not being able to go out and build your own life, not going out and being able to self-determine, but being the kind of citizen or worker that somebody else wants you to be.
So this is kind of what I just said, what role does Common Core play in educating the workforce? It sorts, labels, and slots a bunch of things. We talked about it sorting, labeling, and slotting students for their future very early on, as we'll see. It also labels teachers. You might have heard teachers get a ranking based on how well their students do. Okay, so it's sorting and labeling those teachers as good or bad. You might have seen this, you might have seen your school or your school district get a letter grade here, like an A or a B, right? That's been touted by Governor Walker. That's a labeling function, and it's all based on, a lot of it's based on these tests, okay? These tests and Common Core also forms and trains in that if you're expecting students to do well on a test and you know what's going to be on the test, you have to change your curriculum to be what's on the test. You have to teach to that test if you expect to compete and be labeled an A school or a good teacher. It also provides a model for compliance. By doing that, by changing your curriculum in your community so that you can satisfy the requirements of the test, you're being compliant with what the government is mandating you to do. Okay, you're showing compliance, and it enforces the compliance by actually punishing school districts that fail to do well enough in these things. And it also punishes teachers by demoting them or calling them from the staff if they continuously do not perform. So this is a white paper that was put out by the Gates Foundation, and it talks about a framework for multi-state human capital data system. They're talking about a data system to store all this information and building it.
Just so we're clear, the Gates Foundation funds a ton of this stuff.
So it says reorienting accountability arrangements around longitudinal data acknowledges that developing productive citizens is a core goal of all levels of education. While workforce development is not the only goal of education, it's one of the most systematically measurable. Through existing data collection activities undertaken by the state and federal agencies responsible for labor market information. So what that's basically saying is we need to collect all this because of all the things that education does, this is the stuff we can measure, so this is what's important. Okay? Because we can measure these things, what that means is that things, even subjects in school that aren't inherently measurable, art class, music class, sports, wood shop, a lot of things like metal work, all this kind of thing would not really be measurable in a standardized or systematic way, so it's going to become less important. The same way other things like becoming a good person, like other eternal truths you might have and beliefs and things like that. They're not as measurable, so they're not going to show up.
Like learning how to write persuasively, which is one of the greatest tools that we could possibly have as citizenry, right? As an individual citizen.
So what we've got here, what education's become is sort of what's termed the factory model of education, where students come in, and I think of little kindergartners coming in as raw products, and they go through this education system and they come out a finished product all the same. Kind of wish this graphic could have been done a little better if you saw more diversity in those raw products and the same uniformity coming out the end. I did want to point out that some of the things that are being called out here are exactly that with Common Core. The creativity, discipline, and intelligence are all being called out and left aside for the sake of compliance and a uniform product coming out the other side. We're not teaching for creativity in this model. This, of course, all comes from someone around the turn of the last century. You might have heard the term Taylorism. This was actually picked up by Henry Ford later and popularized to make him a whole lot of money. But Frederick Winslow Taylor wrote The Principles of Scientific Management, in which kind of invented what's become known as the assembly line before Ford. I mean, the same kind of idea, though. That in the past, he says, in the past man has been first, in the future the system must be first. This is in no sense, however, implies that great men are not needed. On the contrary, the first object of any good system must be that of developing first-class men. And under systematic management, the best man rises to the top more certainly and more rapidly than ever before. This is the sorting and ranking that we're seeing, and this is touted by most education reformers as the kind of thing we want to do. We want to sort and rank. We want to make everything standard and interchangeable in the schools and with the students. What makes all this work? There's a lot of moving components, and we're going to try to go through this pretty quickly. First is standards. This is prescribed pedagogy, what students must learn. We've defined across the nation and even across the world to some extent what students are expected to learn in order to meet a standard. It includes competencies like social and emotional things like we talked about. How kind you are, how forgiving you are, how outgoing, extroverted, or introverted you are, things like that. All kinds of things that you might consider psychological or medical even are in the standards. Curriculum delivery, managing the content, what actually gets taught in every school. The goal actually for many of the people that were behind Common Core at least were to actually be delivering the same lesson in the same class across the country on the same day. Keep everyone moving at exactly lockstep pace. And those delivery systems were more and more clamped down, so there was less opportunity for originality in teachers, the kinds of things that you might remember a teacher that may have inspired you, a teacher that was different than all the rest. They're trying to call that out. They're also wanting to not have ones that are worse than the rest. They want everything to be uniform. So to that end, they're trying to do things like mass education through video, like a single teacher delivering the same lesson on a large screen across the country. They're trying to do things like controlling the inputs by giving kids tablets and making sure that they're putting their input in constantly on a daily basis after each class, and then looking at the results after each class and ranking. Did the teacher do well? Which the students did well? And so on, and then storing that information. They have enforcement. They do psychometric assessment, and they use that psychometric assessment both to label a student, it'll go into a database, but they also do it to do interventions, to try to predict whether that student will drop out, whether they'll join a gang, whether they'll attempt suicide, et cetera, et cetera. All those interventions are now happening based on assessments given at schools. The enforcement also is teacher, school, and district accountability. All these scores, again, into a database, and the data is used to judge how well teachers are doing, how well schools are doing, how well districts are doing, and then punishing or rewarding those districts, schools, and teachers based on that. All of this is all enabled by a very large data system. Our country has developed a data model that all of the states have developed their own actual hardware systems to store. So they all store it in the same data model. They can all share their information. States are building up linkages to share that information to other state agencies. And now we're also starting to see states linking that data up to marketing firms and companies in terms of doing hiring. The data flow is really of concern here because it's really a privacy thing. Whether you answered a question correctly in second grade or whether, what your attitude was about sports, say, in second grade, should that have a bearing on what years later? That'll all be able to be brought up into making a general makeup profile of yourself.
In fact, one of the primary goals of gathering all this information and keeping it in a permanent file on the student, and there are permanent files, is that eventually this will be shareable with potential employers. So that if you did have, for example, behavioral problems in the 6th grade or the 8th grade or the 10th grade, that would be information available in all likelihood to an employer. That's part of the goal, is so that they know, okay, this is a student who's actually ready, who's preformed in the way that I need them to be, or they're not.
So I want to just, we are short on time, but I'll just take 2 minutes for this. Why do you think that's necessary? Well, in 1971, there was a court case, Briggs versus Duke Power Company in North Carolina. And it made it illegal for a company to use IQ tests in their hiring process. So you can't use a general test of intelligence in order to hire. Later, there's cases actually before the courts now that are actually saying you can also not, so what companies did is they moved to personality tests. You might have taken some of those when you went for a job. Like they're not intelligence tests, but they try to determine what you're extroverted, introverted, a leader, follower, all that kind of stuff.
How you work with others.
How you work with others, all that. Those are being challenged as well on the Americans with Disability Act. They're a violation of that people with whatever anger issues or shyness issues or whatever that could be considered a disability, and you shouldn't be able to test for it and hire someone based on it. So what is a company to do? Well, they turn to schools who do testing every day. They know what they're doing with that. And they essentially have them now do their intelligence testing and their personality testing. And they even turn over and start awarding students badges when they hit certain milestones. And these badges will be able to be presented at companies that I have, look at my set of badges, that I'm this kind of person with this kind of skills and these kind of things. That'll be considered for hiring. So we'll talk to Kirsten, talk about who's driving this train.
Who is driving this train? I have a lot to say about this. So, the people who are driving this train are big government and big business, Tweedledee and Tweedledum. They're best buddies. And we like to refer to this as public-private partnership. You may have heard that term. A more trendy term that is now being used because the people who are driving this kind of train have figured out that we're on to public-private partnership. So whenever that happens, they tend to rebrand. They find a new term. The new trendy term is social impact bonds. So they are forming these relationships in order to leverage students and in order to get their human capital or to get the data that they want from the human capital, and it's called a social impact bond. It sounds all just lovely. So here are some basic mechanics of how public-private partnership works, and it's a little oversimplified, but I think that this is a pretty decent view of how it functions. So you've got 3 points on the triangle. You've got government at the top. Government is force. Government has the power to make you do things. Business is down here. Business has most of the money. Now, that doesn't mean government doesn't have money too. Government has some money. Because why? Because they have force and they can take it from you. So government and business are the principal partners. And then over on this other corner, you have non-government organizations, which are often in the form of like local community groups or regional groups that are designed to look like public influence. So when an agenda needs to be pushed, business and government go to these NGOs and they get the agenda out through the NGOs primarily, because you need a way to make it look like it's grassroots, that it's coming from the public, that it's widely accepted among the public, that the public wants these things. So again, government and business together behind closed doors are making policy decisions. They are getting things far enough along down the track using the NGOs so that by the time you know about all of this stuff, the bad stuff or the things that are coming, it's already been made to look like it's widely accepted and it's already too far entrenched for you to easily get rid of it. So it's already, but they're laying down the tracks without you knowing, and then they roll out a PR campaign using the NGOs and their own PR machines, and at that point, getting rid of it is going to be very difficult. Corruption is another word for all of this. I would tell you, there are a lot of people who say, oh, it's really wonderful for business and government to work together, it's efficient. It's not efficient, it's corrupt. Because when you have money and power working together, there will always be private agendas that will arise or that were there from the very beginning. And again, it's going to be a case of a very few people benefiting at the expense of the rest of us. Corruption is not optional to, it is not incidental to public-private partnership, it is endemic to it. Okay. So the results of P3s, or public-private partnership, that's a nice convenient way to shorten it. Theft of taxpayer dollars for the purpose of implementing private agendas. The dissolution of citizen voice, authority, rights and freedoms, and opportunity in order to select winners and losers and create or strengthen rigged and or private markets. So this is not about a general economy, it's not about an open economy. Again, this is all stuff that's designed to rig the economy in the favor of a few powerful players. Just a few reasons why biz wants to control education. First of all, taxpayer subsidization of worker training and employment. If you start looking at the state level right now, what you'll find is, for example, internship programs for kids in high school, junior high and high school. They have eliminated certain laws, or they've done end runs around certain child labor laws that allow them to run these programs. Take kids actually sometimes out of the classroom to be in a workplace for part of the day, or after school, or whatever it happens to be. So the kid might be underage to get an actual work permit, but they have permission to be in this internship program that business and government together have created. And not only are they cleared to be doing these things that they wouldn't be allowed to do otherwise, but guess who's getting money to hire those interns? Business. So your tax dollars are paying for those internship programs. Now, I want to be clear. I have zero problem with an internship program. If a business wants to offer an internship program, I think that's wonderful, but it needs to be a private matter. It should never involve public dollars, because the minute public dollars are involved, then I guarantee you that business is influencing what is happening in the classroom. And government is influencing what's happening in the classroom. And it's not in the child's interest, it's not in the teacher's interest, it's not in the parents' interest, it's not in the taxpayer's interest, it's in the interest of a very small number of people. The politicians who are getting campaign dollars, and the businesses who are getting what they want out of it, whether it's data or workers or whatever. Also, data access. Business wants data for employment purposes. We talked about that a few minutes ago. Product research and development. You know, if I can get a student's data, if I can get a whole slew of student data, or maybe information about what's going on in the classroom, how teachers are interacting with students, all of this. And I guarantee you, almost everything that's happening in a classroom, it's not just testing, almost everything that's happening in a classroom now involves digital technology, and data is being gathered. This is why you see the rise of like iPads or other tablets, laptop computers going into these classrooms, and sometimes Google or other large corporations paying, you know, sometimes hundreds of thousands, or even millions of dollars to ensure that these kids have these devices. Why? Because they're getting the data on the back end. And they can then use this data, which is incidentally, personally, and identifiable. People will tell you up one side and down the other that it's not. There is no such thing as data. Based on the number of data points that are being given, you can absolutely figure out which student is which in almost every single case. So it's not private. And in fact, on the back end, a lot of times it's attached to a social security number. So it makes it really easy. Direct marketing, this is also happening. So the more devices you put in the hands of children, the more digital technologies in the classroom, the more you can actually direct market, right?
So there you go. And you're direct marketing to children, parents, schools. You have large captive guaranteed markets. And Bill Gates has actually, in talking about some of the Common Core and related college and career ready innovation, et cetera, he's talking about having large captive markets directly. He doesn't even hide the fact that that's what he's doing. All right, just a few reasons that government wants to control education. They want to incentivize favored business. Why? Because that gets them campaign dollars. They want to cultivate campaign cash. They want to control information and citizenry. And they want to retain political power. The more they can control what goes on in the classroom, the more they can influence the way kids think, what they do, the more they can ensure that they retain power in some way. Okay. Foxconn is only the most prominent example of how public-private partnership is working at this moment here in the state of Wisconsin. Can you back up just a second? We forgot to fill that slide in the way we wanted. Well, I'll just tell you. So essentially, I don't know if you've watched the headlines at all, but literally, with the amount of money that Foxconn is talking about pouring into the state of Wisconsin, you had the technical colleges, the University of Wisconsin system, and local school districts all literally bending over backwards saying, we will start tailoring programs to make sure that you get what you need. That's, to me, horrifying. If all we're doing is tailoring things so that kids can go work on an assembly line at Foxconn, we have a real problem. Okay, go ahead. So to break it down, P3 wants 3 things out of education, but they actually reduce to just one, and that's data. Because everything that they need or want, they can get through the data. It's the new currency. They can get money and they can get control. And P3 will grab it any way they can. And right now, just so you know, the minute you opt your child into a public school, it is assumed that your child's data belongs to the government. And when you request your child's data, you can't get it. But almost anybody else can, as long as they pose the request the right way. Researchers can get it. Other schools can get it. Potentially down the road here, employers are going to be able to get it. And that is the plan. But you can't as a parent, and the child can't. That data is out of your hands. So we're right back to where we started earlier. Students and student data are just literally a link in a supply chain and a means for government and business to get what they want. Okay, just a few key players willing to exploit your kids. We're going to whip through this super fast. At the federal level, Senator Patty Murray and Senator Lamar Alexander, a Democrat and a Republican, holding hands to push this agenda on your children. This is not a partisan issue. It is Republicans and Democrats alike. George H.W. Bush has been heavily involved in this agenda, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. And right now, Donald J. Trump and his Education Secretary, Betsy DeVos, are also pushing it. They are perfectly fine with it. Bill and Melinda Gates, here's your business. This is the business side of the triangle, the business point. And he's just one of many big business, international corporation types that are doing this kind of stuff and funding it. And then at the NGO side, you have people like Mark Tucker, who actually just retired, but his organization, the National Center on Education and the Economy, has been huge in influencing policy. Mark Tucker wrote something called the Dear Hillary letter, which was entered into the congressional record by a federal legislator who was very concerned about what he found in that letter. It was written in 1992 on the eve of Bill Clinton's election as president. To his first term, must read. because it is literally the blueprint for what we see happening today. Almost all of it is unfolding. And crystallizing the Dear Hillary letter that Mark Tucker wrote, we can do that with this one quote. He talks about remolding the entire American system into a seamless web that literally extends from cradle to grave and is the same system for everyone, coordinated by a system of labor market boards at the local, state, and federal levels where curriculum and job matching will be handled by counselors accessing the integrated computer-based program. Does that sound like self-determination to you? Because it sure doesn't to me. As a parent, as a grandparent, as an aunt, as an uncle, as a brother or a sister, do you believe that any child should have their future determined for them? Or should they be allowed to determine their future for themselves? It is time that we allow children once again to determine their futures for themselves with the help of parents and teachers, but without the interference of big government and big business. Some key documents relating to workforce model education that you should really know about. And two of them, interestingly enough, come from Mark Tucker's organization, National Center on Education and the Economy. The first was published in 1990. It's America's Choice, High Skills or Low Wages, Commission on the Skills of the American Workforce. And the second, which he released a number of years later, Tough Choices or Tough Times, the New Commission on the Skills of the American Workforce. The third, and I'm going to show you a graphic from one of these in just a moment, but the third is Promoting Grit, Tenacity, and Perseverance by Schechtman et al., which was a white paper produced for the Department of Education, the Federal Department of Education. Oh, honey, can you go back just a second? Federal Department of Education in 2013. Now, my husband is now doing this slide, or he would tell you what I will have to tell you instead, which is that one of the principal things that people have gotten upset about this Promoting Grit, Tenacity, and Perseverance paper over is that it talks about all of these like possible ways to monitor students, monitor students by like putting stuff on their skin that would measure galvanic response as they're doing their work in the classroom, or stuff that would show you where their retinas were going or whatever. There's all sorts of stuff in there about that, and people got like up in arms about it. We are far more concerned about something else that paper had to say. Yeah, let's go to that one first. It says, students can develop psychological resources that promote grit, tenacity, and perseverance, including effortful control in which students are constantly faced with tasks that are important for long-term goals, but that in the short term may not feel desirable or intrinsically motivating. In other words, if I may translate, boring tasks. Successful students by themselves or with the support of others marshal willpower and regulate their attention in the face of distractions. Now what this is telling you, I will break this down for you because we've read the paper and we understand kind of where this is going. They believe that the economy of the future involves a lot of low-level mundane jobs. And they need kids who are able to keep their heads down and stick to those jobs without complaining much. The term STEM that you hear, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, that term was actually developed by the very people who are pushing this system to make you believe that they want to train your kids to be rocket scientists and neurosurgeons. They don't. What they want is low-level tech workers. That's what they think they're going to need. So it's all a lie, it's all a scam, and you know, your kids are the victims of it. Okay, let's go back to this though. This is the graphic I was talking about from Tough Choices or Tough Times, one of Mark Tucker, his organization's papers. So this is, it may be a little hard to see, but what this graphic does is it tells you, it actually explains to you something that I think has been very mystifying to a lot of people. And that is, why are we trying to stop math education at Algebra 2? We've seen a consistent lowering of math education over the years to the point where now under Common Core, most classrooms and most schools will never get kids beyond Algebra 2. Why? Because in this model of education, they are striving eventually to have 10th grade be the highest level before you test out and earn through testing the right to go on. We are literally curtailing students' choices and forcing them into a situation where unless they've leapt through the proper hoops early, they won't have certain opportunities available to them. Okay, so some key federal legislation in relationship to workforce development and education. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, Goals 2000 in 1994. Almost everything else that's come since has been reauthorizations of those two acts. But they are designed to work like gears. They interlock and they continually refer to each other now. So labor and education are being more and more intertwined. This is the goal. We're literally creating a sort of a situation where education is the supply mechanism for labor. Okay, some key players in implementing and maintaining workforce model education. There's a whole ton of folks who are now generally on board with all of this, a wide array of corporations, all the way down to labor unions. And I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a ton of workforce development boards that have sprung up at the state, regional, and local levels. These boards are now often working directly with school boards. What about Wisconsin at the state level? We have a hard stop, I know at one, but there is at least, we're going to try and get as much in as we can. Tommy Thompson's a mess, but keep going, honey. Okay, let's play this video. Oops, can you go back and you have to actually click on the middle of the video.
Marco Rubio there.
No, hang on.
Oh, no.
Okay. There we go.
Governor, as you look past the budget now that it's behind you, if you will, what would you say your top 3 goals are in the next year?
Oh, I think. Hang on just a second, I'm just gonna get rid of that.
Governor, as you look past the budget now that it's behind you, if you will, what would you say your top 3 goals are in the next year?
Oh, I think they're all related. I mean, for me, it's overall continue to create a better business climate. We don't create jobs. We want to create jobs and say, I got to make it easier for you and everybody else in the city who actually creates jobs. So better business environment, better environment to create jobs. Secondly, as we talked about before, we got to help develop the workforce. We got to find more ways, more effective ways to help people get the skills they need to fill the jobs that are open and the jobs that could be open if we had a steadier street out there. And that's immediate. And the third fits into that, and that's continuing education. Because it's not only the short-term needs that we have to fill those 30,000 to 40,000 jobs I talked about on the website that open now, it's also going forward knowing that a huge challenge, and I think not only here in Wisconsin, but across the country, is largely been overshadowed because of the slow recovery out of the recession. And what I mean by that is people who are at their retirement age are working longer than expected because their 401ks are exactly what they thought they'd be a few years ago. That's kind of masked the fact that you've got this whole baby boomer generation who is at or near retirement age. Going forward, particularly people in HR across the state know that there's a huge challenge out there. That if we want to continue to keep our businesses here and attract new ones, we've got to have a steady supply of well-trained, well-prepared workers to fill this position. In the short term, it's what I talked about with workforce development, but really in the long term, is making sure we continue to transform education and have great schools, be they public, charter, private, virtual, whatever they might be, and to continuously upgrade and improve it. One of the things that gets hardly any attention, but one of the things that fits right into that is We put money in this budget to help schools all across the state do academic and career plans as early as 6th grade. You look at Europe, particularly Germany, you know, they're early on, they're helping young people figure out what are my interests, what are my talents, what are my skill sets. And they treat the young people who pick a career path as a craftsman just as highly as they do someone who's an engineer or a doctor. And somehow we've lost connection to that. And so with those academic career plans, we're trying to help young people figure out the right path that they need to be on, because increasingly, not just the job, but the careers that are open, require 2 but now 4-year degrees, and in many cases, they pay more.
Okay, he goes on, but what he's basically described is exactly what we're talking about. Scott Walker is fully on board with this
Governor's youth.
development agenda. Yes, we need to go to the next. Let's load.
Governor.
We're gonna need to come out of it again to play the. So we need to. Why won't we live here? Kind of looks like a South Park here.
Which one?
Tony Evers.
We're here today to talk about academic and career planning. And I can think back when I was in 6th grade, I think the last thing I wanted to think about was what I was going to do for the rest of my life. I was more interested in the very next day. Well, the world has changed, clearly, and that's what's very exciting about our new efforts around academic and career planning. It's part of our agenda to make sure that every child is a graduate ready for college and career. The thing I really like about it, it really gives students some more control over their future. They can start thinking about it. Will 6th graders say, yes, I'm going to be a neurosurgeon and that's going to happen? Unlikely. But the fact of the matter is, if people start thinking about their futures, what careers are available, how we connect those careers with what courses are taken, then it's going to work, and students will be able to systematically move towards a great place to be. So it's important for us as adults to support this academic and career planning process. It's going to begin in the 2017-18 school year, not too far down the road. And in the meantime, we're going to be doing pilots. We really want districts to start being engaged. And I can tell you just from my work around the state with the business community, they're absolutely jazzed about this. And I think this is a really good way to make their partnership even more meaningful than it is now. So again, please join in the conversation around.
So essentially, we're going to wrap up now because we have the hard stop.
But what you've just seen is that both Scott Walker and Tony Evers are fully on board with the workforce development agenda. They think this is a good thing. And unfortunately, it is going to shortchange children, and it's going to continue to do that. And not only is it going to do that, but it's going to undermine our voice as a citizenry over the long haul. Because if kids don't have the eternal truths that they need in order to structure and direct their own lives, then essentially they are reduced to dependent cogs in our society. And they will not be able, they won't have the tools to stand up that they need. So what we would ask you actually is to think about a couple of things, just very quickly. School choice is great, but not as it's currently structured. Charters and vouchers, essentially what happens, especially with vouchers right now, is that the money follows the kids into these private schools, and that means that the regulations attached to that money also go into the private schools rather. So essentially, people like Bill Gates have supported school choice and Common Core specifically because they know that if they can get their money and public dollars into the private schools, their agenda gets into the private schools as well. It's like a virus, so it spreads from the public to the private. We would love to see the state of Wisconsin start rejecting federal dollars. That is one of the fondest desires of my heart and my husband's. And the reason is because of all the strings that are attached to that federal money. The minute you cut that money, the strings start to go away, and Wisconsin could start calling its own shots again. Now, is that a guarantee that nothing's going to be centralized, that government and business aren't going to partner in corrupt ways? No, because that can happen at the local, at the state and local level just as well as it can happen at the federal level. But you start to be able to have like a throat that you can choke at the state and federal level, or at the state level and local level. You don't have that at the federal level. We can't touch those people. They won't do what we ask. So cutting off the funds is essential, and frankly, it's doable. Wisconsin is a state that regularly spends, gives more to the federal government than we get back. If we stopped this chain, we would actually be able to use our own money more efficiently, but it takes people with courage to say, we're not going to take that money. We're not going to take it. It's only about 12% of our education budget, and we could tighten our belts and do a better job without that federal money. In addition, we should be pushing for what's called opt-in legislation. You heard me say earlier that the minute you enroll your child in a public school today, their data is considered the government's. If we had an opt-in, if parents had to sign something, say, yes, you can use my child's data, instead of an opt-out, which is very difficult to get anyway, because everything that's happening in the classroom is essentially a way to gather data at this point. If there was an opt-in, if parents had to sign a form saying, yes, you can use my child's data, it would put a screeching halt to so much of what is going on. Because without the data, the wheels of this machine can't turn. And again, putting the biggest burden for funding local education should be at the local level. Why? Because it gives the local level more control. And unfortunately, right now, we have a situation, thanks to Tommy Thompson, where the state is now funding education, public education, at the level of about 2/3. So until that balance shifts back, so that it's the local level that's primarily funding education, that the control is going to remain with the state and the feds, and the state is really beholden to the feds. So I think that is where we're going to have to leave it, but we really thank you so much for your attention today and for coming. We thank the candidates for their interest in this topic, and we hope that if you have questions, you'll come find us. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, guys. That was excellent. Thank you. Like I said, I hope today some of our views got challenged and we start thinking about these. And like I said, for those of you who aren't running for office, those of you who are voting, I hope you'll take into consideration what each of us brings to the table. And that, like I said before, the end goal is we want what's best for our kids. We want what's best for the education system. And we may not all agree on how we get there, but the end goal is the same for all of us. I want to say a special thanks to Don Carlson for helping arrange all this, the room here. We couldn't have done it without Don, and he's a great guy. And for those of you not in the Libertarian Party, I'm going to embarrass Brian Deferding a little bit. For those of you who don't think Libertarians get elected, Brian Deferding was elected to Winnebago County Board Supervisor. Thanks to our candidates, thanks to our speakers. Just hope you appreciate everything we're doing out here. So if you could, we're going to leave the first 2 rows intact, but if you guys could help stack the chairs for the back rows, it'd be much appreciated.
Matt, quick. All the video from today's presentation will be on YouTube under Wisconsin International Radio. So if you are on Facebook or whatever and can share that video at some point, will be this video immediately, and then there'll be a more properly edited video soon. But Wisconsin International Radio on YouTube.
Yeah, thank you, Miles. Thanks, President. Yeah, thank you, Miles. Have a good day.
If you're interested, we do have books for sale for $20.
And if you are a candidate running for office and you happen to be in my political party, get your ASS over here.